morning, church. So good to see you this morning. Well, I always say that just because it's kind of a habit, but I hope that you're well this morning. Welcome to Discipleship Together. My name is Jason Wiggin. If you're new, I'm one of the pastors here at Redwood Chapel. I want to welcome you to our live broadcast this morning. Hope you're doing well in this shelter-in-place season that we're all in. Hope that you are healthy, that you are not going too stir crazy. You know, one of the things that my family has to do on a regular basis is just get out and go for a walk, go for a hike, get on our bikes, go outside. And so I just hope that whatever you need to do to stay sane, to stay healthy, please do that at this time. Glad that you're with us here this morning. After our broadcast or after our teaching, we're going to be jumping into some Zoom discussion groups. And so that link is down below in the description bar or in the description box, so you can go ahead and check that out. We'd love for you to join us in our small group discussion afterwards. There is also a link to a prayer sheet. If you have a prayer request or something going on in your life that we as a church or we as a group can pray for, please let us know. We'd love to be able to pray for you. Also, if you are interested in our prayer chain or prayer buddies, where one family or household will call and check in on another family or household during the week, we'd love to make that available to you. So please let us know if that's something you'd like to be a part of. If you have your Bibles, open them up to Matthew chapter 5. We're going to continue in our teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, what commentators call the greatest sermon of all time. Jesus speaking to his disciples who are listening. What would life look like if we took the gospel seriously? Tim Keller calls it the upside down kingdom. It's a life that's lived opposite from the world as we know it or the world that we live in. John Mark Comer calls it Jesus' Manifesto for a whole new way to live. And in the sermon, Jesus challenges and disrupts the cultural normal of the day to show people something better, a better way to live, a more fulfilled way to live, and not just in their own personal life, but in how they interact with others. His teaching still rings true today, maybe even more so now 2,000 years later. What Jesus has to say is completely countercultural to what we live in today. It is not the norm. It is completely, totally different than what we are used to today. And it might be helpful, especially in the days that we're living in right now. Last week we looked at how Jesus sets up this sermon to give us a completely different paradigm on what the good life is, on what the blessed life is. And I would encourage you to go back and hear that sermon just to give you some framework for how the rest of this teaching is going to be. But before we dive into our teaching this morning, I just want to ask, do you remember a little thing back in 2005 that we all got into? It was this little thing called MySpace. Do you remember MySpace? Do you remember how you had like 10 friends, like your top 10 friends that you would put there, and you were totally OG if you left Tom in the number one spot because Tom was the guy who created MySpace, and you wanted to give proper props to Tom. You could customize everything. You could write long diatribes about who you were, your history, put up pictures, and I think my favorite thing about it, which also was the worst thing about it, was that you could go to other websites and you could download or you could copy a code. You could completely customize your MySpace page. So like when people clicked on your page and went to it, it wasn't just the regular boring white background. It had like I remember mine. It was like a beach with moving waves in the background, and like I think some Beach Boys music was playing, and the different boxes that had information about me had a different kind of sheen to them. I mean, it was just, you could totally trick it out. And the problem was, if you didn't have a good enough computer, you couldn't watch it, or you couldn't look at you couldn't actually look at the page, right? Because it would just take so long to load. There was so much information that your CPU was trying to process. You couldn't actually use it. After MySpace, we all kind of left MySpace. It was kind of like the forgotten child. There was this explosion of social media, specifically in 2007. Starting in 2007, there were three behemoths of social media that still exist today. And those, of course, are Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And Facebook, Facebook kind of cleaned up the messy edges of MySpace. Kind of made everything uniform, so everybody's Facebook page looked the same. You could customize, obviously, all of the little details about yourself, but you couldn't change the layout. You couldn't move. There wasn't any moving backgrounds or anything like that. And you could basically, it was basically good for, especially at the beginning, it was good for posting pictures of your vacations. It was good to, I thought it was great to be able to catch up with friends that I hadn't talked to since high school. And then, eventually we all loved it because we got to broadcast all of our patently absurd political theories and conspiracy theories, and just kind of become professionals or become experts at everything, and we post it all on Facebook now. Twitter showed us the brilliance that conversation and discussion, of discourse, of back and forth, of mutual respect were all so blasé, they were a waste of time, that the best thing to do was to have discussion and conversation with 140 characters. And that's the best way that we're going to ever figure anything out. And so you just take 140 characters, which eventually became 280, and now we can really have dialogue about the world and about problems and politics and solve things with 280 characters. And no way, and Twitter was just going to solve all of our problems, because who's got time for real conversation, right? Instagram became the showcase for all things positive and glamorous and fake. Now we had a place to learn about how to bake, how to dress, and how to live our best lives every day without trouble. And I say all this with tongue in cheek, but and I say it with a very, very deep sense of sarcasm and cynicism. I'm laying it on pretty thick. But what unified all of these platforms of social media was the concept of, hey, look at me, right? I mean, that's a lot of what social media is. And listen, I use social media, and I'm not saying if you do, it's a bad thing, but you have to be honest, a lot of social media is just, hey, look at me. And, when I post pictures, and I think I've said this, when I post pictures on Instagram or when I do anything on Facebook, it's rarely to express just how difficult life is right now. It is, if you look at my feed, it is my happy kids, my beautiful backyard, and because I want you to think that everything is good in me. But it's look at me. It is. At some level, there is some selfishness and narcissism that is flowing through all of these things. There's something in all of us. We want people to believe or hope in us that we're doing well, that our life matters, and specifically the things that we do or the things that we say are having a positive impact on other people, or just any impact. We want to know that we don't just live in some kind of cave all by ourselves, but that if we post a picture, if we post an inspiring quote, if we post anything political, that people are going to hear it, they're going to read it, they're going to see it, and they're going to be impacted on it. Nobody becomes a blowhard on Facebook because they want to just talk in a vacuum. They want people to read it and possibly change their own opinion. At least that's what we hope. That's what we hope will happen. The question, though, is, are the things that we're saying actually making an impact, or are they just out there for no reason? Are they actually turning people away? I would argue that a lot of times on social media, the things that we do or the things that we say actually turn people away more than they turn people on. Does that make sense? This morning, I want to look at, we're going to continue in looking through the Sermon on the Mount, looking at Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16, and answering this question: what does Christianity and what do Christians have to offer the world? What good can they offer to the world? In our increasingly postmodern, increasingly secular, harsh world, what can we offer? What goodness can we bring to the table, especially in a time such as this, where there are so many questions, so many uncertainties, so many things that are threatening our way of life? What can Christians bring to the table that will be helpful? Rather than just speaking out loud or making noise, how can we actually help the situation. So let's go to Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. And if you didn't already do it, you can download the half sheet in the description below, and you can follow along. There's a place to fill to write some notes if that's helpful to you. But let's read this together in Matthew chapter 15, Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 13. Jesus says this: "You are the salt of the earth." He's talking to his disciples. He's talking to other Christians. "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." Again, last week, Jesus begins his great teaching by showing his followers that the very notion of what the good life is, what the blessed life is, what a happy life is, looks completely upside down and different than what maybe the status quo is. Jesus then turns his attention of his followers in his teaching to how the good life, not only what it looks like, but what it looks like, and specifically not just how to be blessed, but how to be a blessing. Now, on the surface, this may seem strange, especially looking at the metaphors that Jesus uses. He says, "You are salt and light," but the reasons for both are encouraging and challenging. Let's look at them briefly. And again, if we were to unpack these completely, we would be here all day, and that's not what we're going to do. In verse 13, Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under feet." Now, think about why you use salt. Think about when you're cooking something, when you're barbecuing, when you're preparing food. Why in the world would you use salt? I mean, it's probably just a go-to. I know when I'm cooking, when I'm barbecuing, when I'm preparing something, especially in meats, it's not even a question. The first thing I grab is before all the spices or before all the flavorings and the herbs or whatever, I grab that kosher salt and I grab a big handful and throw it on there, because the secret is more salt than you think. But we're going to do a cooking show on another day. But right now, let's get into God's Word. You use salt for two reasons primarily. One, you use it for flavor, obviously, and probably more so in ancient times or before modern technology and preservatives. It was used as a preservative. Salt was used in long voyages. You would take your meat and you would just heavily salt it, and it would actually preserve the meat so that you could use it. This is before modern refrigeration, and so you had to douse things really with salt. And salt does two things. It brings out the best of what can be there. Have you ever taken a bite of like some tri-tip that somebody forgot to put seasoning on? Like, it's still good and I'll still eat it, but man, where is that seasoning? I need some salt. Salt brings out the best of what that tri-tip can be. Salt brings out the best of what that steak or that fish or that dish, whatever it is that you're eating, it brings out the flavor, it brings out the best. And it also preserves the best that can be there. Christians are to bring out the best of what can be. It means that a Christian ought to look at the world that we live in and see the good that needs to be nourished or brought to the forefront. Now let's make sure that we're clear on this. We as Christians do not believe that we have the corner market on morality. We do not believe that we are the only ones who can be good or live good and moral lives. That is not, we don't believe that, we don't teach that, the Bible doesn't teach that. As salt, what we are to do is we are to identify the good around us and bring it to the surface. That's what salt does to meat. It brings the flavor to the surface. That which is most desirable for good human flourishing. And for most of human history, the world lived in a shame and honor culture, right? All the great civilizations in the world. Do you remember middle school and high school? Do you remember being in World Civ and all those classes? And we studied the Romans, the Greeks, the Mongols, the Persians, the Egyptians, the Aztecs, the Mayans. almost every culture that has lived in the world, not all, but most of them, lived in shame, what we might call shame and honor cultures, where it was unheard, where you would strength was the highest good. As a nation, you would never think twice about taking over another country, because if you were the more powerful, you would just go out and you would conquer, you would acquire more land. If there were weak people, we have examples of Greek and Roman culture where if a family thought that a baby was not desirable, they would discard it. You look at Mayan and Aztec cultures where the strong would devour the weak. I mean, that's the way that the world worked for many cultures around the world. It was unheard of, or at least it was very uncommon, to extend grace or mercy on other human beings, because if you weren't strong enough, then you needed to be discarded. You needed to be left behind, because your weakness was going to slow down the rest of culture and society. Not all humans in the history of the world, not all humans were seen as equal or having equal status under the law. That's hard to accept for us, because we live in a world, in a culture, in a society where our very Constitution says that every human being has certain unalienable rights, that we're all supposed to be treated equally under the law, that as individuals we all have value. As Christians, and by the way, that comes from Christian morality, which that's another discussion for another day. But as Christians, we are to see everybody, see people with value, see what good can come about in our culture. Just some examples of how Christians have brought out the best of human flourishing in the past. The first documented person to ever speak out against slavery was in the 3rd century A.D., a man by the name of Gregory. He was a bishop. He was a Christian bishop in the city of Nyssa. His writings, he regularly spoke out. Again, the first recorded writings against the practice of slavery. Everyone else just thought it was a regular thing that you did. The bishop of Nyssa, Christian man, thought that this was wrong. Again, just going through examples, the intrinsic value of individuals came from Christian monks in the Middle Ages, before the Enlightenment. The idea of unalienable rights came from the founding fathers, who were rooted in Judeo-Christian values. The abolition movement of the 18th century was led by Christian churches. The women's rights movement, if you go back into the history of that, was started by Christian churches who believed that women were not being treated fairly under the law. The civil rights movement was led initially by Christians, not only, but initially by Christians, by Christian pastors and ministers in the South. If you look at different tragedies that have happened all over the world, it's often been churches and Christians, again, not only, but churches and Christians who have been at the forefront of rebuilding. A great example of this is when that devastating earthquake happened in Haiti many years ago. Churches, especially from America, American Christian churches were at the forefront of the rebuilding and the relief effort. And then after it became unpopular, or after it didn't get you any more clicks and likes on social media, a lot of people left, but the churches are still there rebuilding that country. All that to say, Christians have a history of generosity, taking care of and showing real tangible love to their neighbors. It's part of our DNA. It goes into the very life of Jesus, who was constantly bringing the poor up by giving value to the oppressed, by bringing justice where there was injustice. That was Jesus's mantra. He brought out the best in the society, in the culture. Now, Christians, let's just be fair. Have Christians in the past abused this position or failed in their efforts? Of course we have. We have failed, we have done wrong, we have done what we thought were good things in the name of Jesus, which weren't. But to continue to be fair, every subgroup of people on the planet, whether religious or not, has a list of failures to reference. But this doesn't negate Christians who have done good in the past to bring out the best in humanity. Now, what does this look like today? I'll give you three practical examples before we move on. Three practical examples of bringing out the good in our society. Number one, we as Christians ought to resist the urge of online self-righteousness, which is prevalent, which is everywhere in our culture and our society. Number two, to build a reputation. And this one's hitting me this week. I heard a sermon on Sunday during my run this has been resonating for me. Build a reputation of being someone who is kind. Someone who goes out of their way to not be harsh, but to be kind and generous to others. And then finally, be willing to sacrifice or to invoke loss for yourself for the sake of others, especially in times when no one else will know about it. So salt brings out the good that's already there, or salt brings out the good that can be there in a society. But number two, salt preserves the good that's already there. This idea is built on the presupposition that goodness and morality are not exclusive to Christianity, which we've already talked about. Think about the great humanitarian efforts of the world. Many of the ones we've already talked about have roots in Christian ethics and taken inspiration from Christianity. And why was this all possible? This was possible. Why is good even possible in our day, whether from a Christian or from an unbeliever? I'll give you the reason why, and it's a theological one. So stay with me here. There's an idea of God's grace that comes in two forms. One, his special grace, and his common grace. Now, God's special grace has to do with things like salvation, forgiveness, answers to prayer, miracles, where God intentionally supersedes, breaks the barrier between time and space, and does something specific for a person. But God's common grace has to do with things that all humans receive all the time. Things like rain and happiness and food, shelter, community, good government, clothes to wear, social justice, and a desire to do good for others. All people, regardless of their religious association, have a capacity to do good. We Christians should not think, again, that we're the only ones to do good. And yet, Christians have as a responsibility to live as salt in the world. We have a spiritual obligation to advocate for the good things of the world that need to either be brought to the surface or to be preserved. We ought to be advocates for making peace among enemies. We ought to be advocates for forgiveness and what that looks like. Lifting up the oppressed and the forgotten. We ought to be advocates for the end of war, for peace in our day, for responsible environmental stewardship. We ought to be advocates for giving to the needy, using nonviolence to fight against corruption and social injustice, to name a few. We ought to be preserving those things that do exist, but keeping them in. So as salt, we bring to the surface the things that are already there, but we also preserve the things so that they continue on in years to come. Many ways to do it. The third metaphor that Jesus uses, and the third good that Christianity can be in the world, is to show the world what our motivation is and why we are the way that we are. Verse 14 says this: "You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." I'll close with this. Jesus goes through a rhetorical explanation of the purpose of light, to show the way to something, to illuminate something, and to bring into view things that would have been otherwise hidden. Jesus says you're supposed to be in the world, or that's what you're supposed to be in the world. Lights that show people the way to something or to someone. Our lives and actions, our deeds, our choices, our words are to be a guiding path to something greater than ourselves. We ought to be showing the reason why we want to bring good to the surface. We want to show people the reason why we want to keep good and preserve good in our society. It's not for us. It's not for our own gain. It's not for so that we can have bigger churches or more influence in politics or that people will like us or whatever reason. The reason why we live the way that we do, the choices that we make, is to show the world that there is a God who models these things and does these things even, better than us. That there is a God who sees the good in the world because he is the good in the world. That the good can exist and persevere and be preserved because God is the one who ultimately gives it and brings it and makes it. We as lights of the world are to show the goodness and the grace and the life and the mercy of our God in heaven, that he is not far away, that COVID-19 has not taken him by surprise, that the breakdown of the current kind of crumbling of society a little bit, the collapse of our economy, all of these things are not taking God by surprise, nor are they outside of his domain, nor is he indignant or apathetic or indifferent to the things that were going on, but is near to us, close to us. And as believers, we are to, as light, we are to show people that. In short, we need to be more like the Amish. I'll finish that thought. I know, I wanted to let that sit for a second. We need to be more like the Amish. Think about this, or go backwards in your mind. You remember 2006? There was a gunman named Charles Roberts who burst into an Amish schoolhouse, and he held the students, he held the kids there for hostage for a while. He ended up shooting 8 little girls in this schoolhouse, and he killed 5 of them before killing himself. Now, in the aftermath, the news was in a flurry, obviously because of what had happened. Anytime there's a shooting, the news media is all over it, and everybody starts asking the question, why? And inevitably, the cameras made their way to the gunman's his house where his wife and his children were, and to his parents' house, and were flooding them. And immediately when that began to happen and blame started being, how come you didn't stop this? And just the intense scrutiny and pressure on the surviving family of the gunman, the Amish showed up. Specifically, the parents of the children that this gunman had killed showed up at the parents of the gunman's house and the surviving family to offer their support, their love, their care, and to let them know that they had forgiven the gunman for what he had done. And this wasn't months later, this was days later. And why did they do it? Why in the world would they go? They had every justifiable reason to hate this family, to hate this wife, to hate these parents for what this gunman had did, and instead their devotion to God, their devotion to Jesus Christ, led them to be salt and light to this horrified, grieving family. They brought out the best. And then what happened was there was a whole conversation about forgiveness. Our country for months had a whole conversation about the value of forgiveness. Articles were written, books were written about the value of forgiveness and why it needs to be a part of our culture again in America. The Amish were just living as salt and light. They were taking Jesus' words seriously to try to bring some good into our society. This week we have an opportunity to be salt and light in our communities. And it's certainly more of a challenge these days due to our shelter-in-place order, but it is, as Christians, it is our calling. It is the good that we can offer to the world today, to preserve the good that already exists and to keep it in our society, to be a light, to show people who God is, to point to Him in these trying and difficult days. Let me pray for us, and then we will exit this video and get into our Zoom discussion. Father, thank you so much for the opportunity to be together virtually. And God, I pray that as your children, as your disciples, as your people, we would be salt and light to people who need to see and experience good in our troubling days, that we would be a light to show people how amazing and wonderful and glorious and loving and merciful that you are. Thank you, God, for that responsibility and opportunity. Help us to be strong in these days and to hold on to the hope that we have in your Son, Jesus Christ. We love you. Amen. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be in Zoom discussions in about a minute. See you there.